Hi, I'm Pastor Ben. This is our Together Tuesday course, How the Light Shines Through, presented here for you online. This class is going through the book of the same name by Chad Lakeys. But once again, this class is not the book. If you want a summary of the book, you need to read the book. But what it is a class built upon that. This session will be talking about chapters 5 and 6 with an emphasis on chapter 6. The fundamental question that these chapters are addressing is that of identity. And one of the issues with identity is actually, it's a very recent term. If you look at the entire Bible, you don't find the word identity. There wasn't really a word for that. And instead, what it comes to the way we think and the questions we ask. The Bible, I think, does address the question of identity quite directly, but it's interesting that it wasn't the same type of questions that we have now with that topic, because it's such an important topic these days. And Lakeys, borrowing from Charles Taylor, talks about the way in which we imagine how we find answers. He has a term for it, the social imaginary. How do we find and trust things? One of the challenges in the postmodern world is that we tend to trust what we find internally. A phrase we'll often use is, does this resonate? And in what that suggests is that I'm going to look inside to try to find some kind of truth, and then whether it resonates with my experience. At a certain level of that makes some sense. However, in another aspect, it's quite difficult, because if I am faced with a crisis of who I am and what I'm about, and I don't know the answer and I'm not finding it, the only way I can measure whether it's true or not for me is finding the answers internally. Well, what if I don't already have the answers internally? And so instead, there were time periods where an external source was really helpful, and that there was a question of, should I trust what's internally within me? Maybe not. Maybe I should be looking far more externally toward a source or a religion or an inheritance, something passed down. And in chapter 5 of his book, he talks about the challenge, especially for young people, of trying to find themselves, that they need to figure out internally who I am and what my purpose, what my identity is, and how challenging that can be. And if there isn't a lot of freedom in the ability to say, well, it's not about what's internally, it's about where you could serve. The Lutheran doctrine of vocation is about wherever you are right now, there you're called to serve. And some of those places you chose, some of them you did not choose. Some things are in between, but it doesn't change the fact that God's calling you to serve one another in this place. It takes away that existential angst. It's such a postmodern idea anyways, that existential kind of internally looking for truth, but I don't know what truth is, and I don't want to find it externally, and you end up with this loop of difficulty and self-doubt. And so we want to recognize how important our frame of mind or social imaginary is, how I think of those around me, or how I think of the world around me, and my expectations for myself and the world around me are all chosen, sort of. Meaning, you don't have to have these expectations, and yet you kind of inherit it by society around you. It's simultaneously inherited from others and created myself, but we recognize there's nothing essential about it. It's all simply ideas. A good example is simply the use of language. Those of us who speak English have just decided that these sounds mean these things, and You could do it differently, and those of you who know more than one language know you think differently with different languages. However, on the one hand, it's completely chosen. On the other hand, it's not chosen. You're in a whole group of people all using it. And if you started to wildly innovate, people wouldn't understand you. And so there's a side to, it's not like you exactly chose it, but you are using it. And it's actually a dialectal thing about social construction, but we don't need to get to, but just simply the social imaginary. What do we expect? And that it really has power in how we think about it. As a case study, imagine how your church thinks about people who are not in it. How do you view others? Now, hopefully, in your own church, in your own context, you view others in a lot of different ways, but thinking about it primarily. So, for example, do you look to others looking for the marginalized whom you are going to help? That's our role for other people, is we're going to help others. Well, when you do that, you start looking for those who need help. And that becomes a primary way of viewing others. Or do you say, well, it's not about necessarily helping others, it might be invaluable, but when I look at others, I see them as potential people to join our group. And so that's what I'm going to use as my lens to see everyone around me. Very different than if you're saying, how am I going to help you? It's instead, my role is, it's an evangelism role to bring the message of Jesus so that you'll believe it. Or do I see others as, it's not about that at all. I'm looking at others as simply, I'm going to be partners with you and we're going to work together on projects. I don't need to help you, you help yourself, and I don't need to try to make you join our group. Instead, I'm just going to be a partner with you, and then we're going to do things we share in common. Or, in fact, do we view others as, I'm here to learn from you? I would say, by the way, in any church, not one of those is wrong. It's just, how do we first look to other people and what do we expect from them? And then what comes out of it? How do I envision it? My social imaginary of how I think of the church's role to relate with others is then going to affect how I actually relate with others, because it's what I expect, so it's therefore what I act upon. That's just all to say a social imaginary. Different ways of thinking are not essential, but there's various ways. And this fundamental question of identity, who am I? It's a very recent question. And I actually think it's helpful to break this down into three components. And this comes from Gerald Zeigel, who makes the case that in Western philosophy, there's three ways of thinking about the self. The first is the most obvious, the material or bodily self. I just relate with those around me because I'm holding the space I am, you're holding the space you are. It's a very material kind of sense. The second is what you might call a relational self. I am who I am in relationship to all the other people. And so very frequently in a relational self, it's a comparative self. I know who I am because I know who others are, which is to say a big part of who I am is who I am not. And who I am not is going to be real people and real groups that I'm familiar with. Because if it's just completely imaginary, then it doesn't matter. What matters is I look at others and see, I am different from you. And then we end up focusing on difference. And the final is what we call the reflective or reflexive self, of the ability for me to sense myself, an existentialist kind of concept of self. So this is important, and I want to focus on that second one, that relational self, because I think it's very helpful for some of the challenges that Laquiz is going to say that we're facing, because the identity discourse we've found ourselves in, at least in America, usually is built on group identity these days more than individual identity. Existentialism is all about individual identity, but very frequently we talk about identity with respect to groups. And there's a variety of ways that we have identity, such as race, gender, nationality, disability, sexuality, religiosity, but that there are identity components to who am I in solidarity with other people, so that we're kind of tied together in some kind of meaningful way, which we're calling an identity. And people have many identities in that sense. But Laquise points out there is a danger in this, because very frequently identity becomes so galvanized when it's tied to being a minority identity. There's a lot of identities that aren't like that, but that when you have an identity where you feel like the other is not the same as you're not able to have the equality of others, your identity can be galvanized even more, and on many of these same categories like sexuality, disability, so on. And if you recall from the very first chapter, he borrows from James Davis and Hunter the concept of ressentiment that includes the concept of resentment, envy, hate, rage, and revenge. And there's felt aspects of disrespect and humiliation. And what this can do is bind a group together tremendously powerfully. But because it is a group on the losing end, and it's important to point out it's the perceived losing end. Sometimes it's a group that really is out on the losing end. They are a marginalized group. Other times, they are a group who thinks they're losing out. But for the point of how the group is binding themselves together through ressentiment, it doesn't matter whether it's real or not. There is a sense that we are going to be binding ourselves together from shared grievance. And again, those grievances can be very real, but it binds people together. The challenge of that is that the group cohesion that you gained is through ressentiment, and it can very easily lead to, how am I different than them? Think back to that relational self. Who am I in contrast to the others? And for me to have a unique identity, and there's been a lot of interest in a unique identity, more on that in a bit, but that in order for that to happen, then I am different from others, and my differences show up mostly. We emphasize the differences because that's what makes us different. And so it's an us and them, I and the other, or maybe others. And how frequently could this happen when you gather in a group of people who even agree on 70%, they only talk about the 30%? And how frequently is it that when we gather among people who are so very close to us, that's when we're at most odds? My example here always was that, when I did some of my graduate work, we had people from all kinds of denominations, and there was never any issue when I would work with Pentecostals. We were so different in the way we approached things. It was just, there was a mutual respect. It was fine. But me being an ELCA Lutheran, if I were to go and work with some Missouri Synod Lutherans, it's awful hard for it not to very quickly devolve into a conversation about women in ministry, LGBTQIA, meaning the things we disagree on rather than the huge number of things we do agree on, given that we have the same confessions and the same so on. But how quickly we could end up focusing on our differences, a relational self, and group cohesion through ressentiment. I am different from you, and I have been aggrieved by you. The challenge with that, and that could be a real thing, but the challenge is we are focusing on our differences in identity, and we're not trying to build a discourse of where are we similar. And so this book argues that being a winsome witness is looking for sameness rather than difference. What John Anatsu calls, can we find our modest unity on what we do actually agree upon? That many of us do actually have similar goals and hopes and dreams, even if we want to achieve them in different ways. There is some unity if we could get over finding consensus. We have a lot of common ground. Very rarely is it that you meet another human that you have nothing in common with. That is not really the case, but it is very common that when we meet one another and we emphasize our differences, we can leave thinking we have nothing in common, when in fact there might in fact be a lot we have in common, and it might be someone we could get along with really well. But if we only talk about the differences, we're not going to get there. And he is going to argue there's something bigger, which is a theological way of finding a posture for us to say, how do I look at another person? We should find a theological anthropology. That I see another human, and I see the other human is someone who possesses the image of God. And the image of God is a phrase from, all the way Genesis 1, that God gives to all humans this image of God. And the word image of God is a little odd in English, but it is the idea that the presence of God is within you. That there is something of God it's a relational word that relates to God. That God is here among you. That there is something inherent to every human, that God has brought us enough together. And so the question is, how would we act and behave if we looked at one another as fellow beings in the image of God, that we are all bound by one creator and thereby are the same creation? And so when we meet another who disagrees so deeply with us, we start with the premise, we're all human and we're in this together. Not because I look at you and I think I really just happen to agree with you more than we do, but because we all are the same image of God. We're all going to be facing a lot of the same challenges, a lot of the same grief, a lot of the same pain, a lot of these things coming together. Is there a way to see this as part of our relationship with God, is to look outside of ourselves? And then we call upon the wisdom of Dietrich Bonhoeffer when it called Jesus the human being for others, which is to say Jesus was not someone who was only for himself before God, but that Jesus was outward for others, that we lived. Remember that we started with this question, where do I find truth? Do I find it internally or externally? For Jesus, it was all external, and it was all relational. It was, I exist for others. And the calling for Christians is the same as Luther said in his Freedom of a Christian, which we quoted in our last session, was that my role is to care for my neighbor. And I don't need to focus so much on myself because my neighbor cares for me. We are people for others. That God has given us the gift of grace so that it can go outwardly to one another. That's what it means to being Christ for each other. And then if you flip that, what that means for the other to be Christ to me. That the church is Christ to one another. The church is for the other, which means when I approach the other, they are Christ to me, just as I am Christ to them. And that the way we relate with one another horizontally in the world is the way we relate with God vertically. And so we are left with a new approach to how do I look outward? How do I find my identity? Well, not in fact through soul searching independently to try to say, who am I in the vastness of the world? But instead relationally. Who am I as the hands and feet of Jesus for my neighbor? That's the theology of vocation, is to say, I have been put in this place in time right now, And some of that was because of good behavior on part of people, bad behavior on part of people. Some of it I chose, some of it is tragic. But wherever we are, relationally, my calling is to my neighbor because there is the image of God within them. And the way I fulfill that calling is by looking at sameness rather than difference. Because when we talk about this in terms of service and care, it is not about ideals that we can disagree upon, but instead relationship and how do we live together and help each other and work together in what Inazu calls our modest unity. That is a theologically different way of seeing the other, so that identity is not isolationist, but instead relational. That is a fundamentally different idea than the way many people struggle with the question of who I am. So this has been our 6th class in this series. Stay tuned for more. I'm Pastor Ben.